They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But mine? It was served beneath a chandelier of white light, in a theater filled with polished shoes and hollow applause, while the man who destroyed me sat frozen in the front row. His hands trembling ever so slightly, his mouth tight, his eyes refusing to meet mine. But I met his. And I did not look away. My name is Emily Graves, and I should start by saying this. I never planned to make my father watch me win. I only planned to survive him. I was not born into love. I was born into rules. Into a house with clean carpets, labeled cabinets, and air that didn't move. Our curtains were always shut, even on sunny days. My mother called it keeping the heat out. But we all knew it wasn't about the heat. It was about not letting the world in. Or worse, keeping something from getting out. I was 7 when I understood what fear sounded like. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't shouting. It was silence. Silence so sharp it could slice into you. My father never hit us. That would be too obvious, too clumsy. His weapon was control. His strength was omission. When he disapproved, he didn't raise his voice, he vanished. Not from the room, but from you. From your life. He would walk past you like you didn't exist. He would answer everyone else at the dinner table but you. He'd make sure your favorite food was on everyone's plate but yours. And he did it all with the same cold calmness as someone rearranging furniture. My mother, Anna, was a ghost in her own skin. She moved quietly, cleaned obsessively, smiled at guests in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. She told me once, if you stay quiet, he won't break you. And then she looked away as if ashamed of having said too much. There was only one person who mattered to my father. My older brother, Nathan. Nathan was everything I wasn't: strong, handsome, popular. From the moment he could walk, Dad had decided he was the one who would carry the Graves name into greatness. Nathan was given everything: new shoes, tutors, sports lessons, praise. Me. I got silence. One day when I was 10, I brought home a drawing from school. A forest I had sketched with colored pencils during recess. My art teacher said it was beautiful, and for a moment I believed her. I rushed home, breathless, excited to show him. Maybe, just maybe, he'd put it on the fridge. Maybe he'd see me. He didn't even look up from the newspaper. You'll never be good enough, Emily. Stop dreaming. I didn't cry. I stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling in my fingers, and then quietly folded it in half. And then again. And again. Until it fit inside my pocket, small and crushed. I never drew again. My childhood wasn't marked by events. It was marked by the things I didn't do. I didn't have birthday parties. I didn't bring friends over. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I didn't ask questions. But I watched. And deep inside me something was building. A quiet rebellion. A rage with nowhere to go. I didn't want to scream. I wanted to prove him wrong. I wanted to look him in the eyes one day and let my existence be his punishment. But before I could get there, I had to leave. The breaking point came when I was 16. It was late November and the air outside was beginning to bite. Nathan had just received his early acceptance letter to an Ivy League school. The house was alive with celebration, champagne, laughter, and compliments. All for him. I had come home with an A on my biology exam. The only A in the class. I waited all night for a chance to say it. Finally, I told my father quietly while he was pouring another glass of wine. He looked at me for a second. Not quite at me. Through me. Emily, he said. Don't embarrass yourself. We're celebrating real accomplishments tonight. That night I packed a bag. No one noticed. I left at 3:12 a.m. The house was still. Nathan was asleep in his golden boy bedroom. My mother lay curled on her side in the master bed, breathing shallowly. And my father, he was exactly as I hoped. Unaware. That was the thing about men like him. They were always watching when you fell. But they never noticed when you disappeared. I walked to the bus station with nothing but a backpack and $87 I'd saved from tutoring other kids in secret. The cold bit into my skin, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I was alive. Free. The ticket clerk asked where I was headed. I didn't know. I looked at the destinations on the flickering board and chose the one that sounded furthest from home. Lexington. I'd never been to Kentucky. But anywhere without my father's shadow was paradise. The first weeks were brutal. I stayed in a shelter, then a shared house for runaway teens. I lied about my age. I worked odd jobs. Washing dishes, folding flyers, wiping tables in fast food chains. I did homework at night and cried in the bathroom when no one was around. No one cared who I was. And for the first time, that wasn't a punishment, it was a gift. Freedom is ugly when it begins. It's cold floors, ramen noodles, and walking to work in the rain. But it's also the sound of your own breath in the quiet, unjudged. It's a smile that isn't forced. It's a voice you start to reclaim. I enrolled in a public high school under a fake address. The guidance counselor raised an eyebrow when she saw how high my scores were. "You've been homeschooled?" she asked. "In a way," I answered. She nodded, not pressing further. Maybe she saw something in my eyes. Maybe she'd seen it before. Kept my head down. Studied harder than anyone else. I had no safety net, no backup plan. Just the knowledge that I had to make it. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew exactly what I was running from. And that was enough. One night, I found a library that stayed open late. It became my second home. Quiet, warm, filled with stories that made me feel less alone. I started to write again. At first just essays for class, then journal entries, then short stories. I didn't draw anymore, but I began to paint with words. By 18, I had a full scholarship to a state university. I got in early. The letter arrived in a small, thin envelope I almost didn't open. I sat on the floor of my shared apartment staring at the words. "Congratulations, Emily Graves." And I cried. Not because I made it, but because I wasn't supposed to. My father's voice had lived in my mind for years. It echoed every time I dared to dream. But that night, for the first time, he was quiet. College was a different world. I wasn't the quiet girl anymore. I spoke up in class. I challenged professors. I ran a writing club and published essays in the school paper. People listened when I talked. They respected me. But I still felt like a ghost with unfinished business. Sometimes I'd see fathers walking their daughters across campus on move-in day. I'd hear laughter in dorm halls when someone called home. And I'd remember the silence I came from. I didn't miss them. But I missed the idea of what they were supposed to be. By the time I was a senior, I had won 2 academic awards, 1 national essay contest, and earned a slot to deliver a speech at graduation. Valedictorian. When I saw my name on the email, my hands shook. But not from fear. From the weight of everything behind me. And from what I was about to do next. Because a month before graduation, I did something I never thought I'd do. I sent my parents an invitation. Just one envelope. No letter. No explanation. Just the invitation and the date. I didn't know if they'd come. But if they did, he would finally see me. He would sit in that chair, surrounded by strangers, forced to listen. He would see my name printed in the program. He would hear my voice amplified through the microphone. And he would know that the little girl he tried to erase was still here. I sent it on a Tuesday. I don't know why that day. Maybe because Tuesdays feel neutral. Not weighed down by Monday's baggage or the looming hope of a weekend. Just a quiet, forgettable middle child of the week. The kind of day you don't see coming. I printed the envelope by hand in neat, perfect cursive. My mother had always emphasized penmanship. "People judge you by your handwriting," she'd say, as if legibility was the highest form of character. Funny. She never noticed that his words were often cruel, but always beautifully written. As I slid the invitation into the mailbox, I hesitated. It wasn't doubt that stopped my hand, it was finality. The truth is, I had already won. I had built a life without them. I had risen without their applause. I didn't need their validation. But I needed something else. I needed to look into the eyes of the man who had reduced me to silence and show him who I became when I stopped listening to him. I needed closure. Not from them. From myself. The days leading to graduation passed in a blur of ceremonies, robe fittings, speech rehearsals, and late nights spent alone, staring at the ceiling. Everyone else was worried about jobs, futures, the next step. I was preparing for war. The speech I wrote wasn't just for the class. It wasn't for the professors or the administrators or even my fellow graduates. It was for him. But I didn't mention him by name. I didn't have to. My words would be my sword, my shield, my rebellion wrapped in applause. The night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. I laid my gown out across the back of a chair and just watched it. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight, like a flag raised before a battle. I ran my fingers over the fabric. I imagined my mother doing the same for my brother once. Not for me. Never for me. I whispered to the darkness, "I'm not invisible anymore." Graduation morning was bright and unseasonably warm. The air was thick with humidity and excitement. Families bustled around campus with cameras and flowers. Friends embraced in clumps, smiling for selfies, eyes red from late-night celebrations. Me. I stood still. I scanned the crowd, wondering if they'd come. If he would come. Part of me expected to be disappointed. Expected them to toss the invitation, laugh it off, sip wine on their polished patio and pretend I didn't exist. But then I saw them. Far off, near the back of the crowd. My father in a stiff charcoal suit. My mother in a beige dress that blended too much with her skin. She looked tired, smaller than I remembered. He looked exactly the same, stern, cold, unimpressed. But older. I stood taller. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I turned and walked toward the stage. The ceremony began with the usual fanfare. Introductions, speeches, endless names called out to echoing applause. I listened with half an ear, my heart beating like a drumline under my ribs. I knew what was coming. My name. And when it came, I walked. Every step forward felt like shedding a layer of the past. Every cheer from the audience chipped away at the years of silence, the years of shame. I climbed the stairs and took my place behind the podium. The sun burned hot above us. But inside me something colder stirred. I unfolded my speech, breathed in, and began. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Graves. And I wasn't supposed to be here. There was a small pause. A quiet ripple in the crowd. I continued. I come from a place where dreams were considered distractions. Where ambition was mistaken for rebellion. Where silence was safer than truth. I come from a house that had windows, but no light. And for years I believed what I was told. That I was too small. Too soft. Too strange. Too much of everything that didn't matter. But I'm here today, not in spite of those voices but because I stopped listening to them. I didn't look at him. Not yet. I stand here because I refuse to be invisible. Because I realized that surviving is not enough. I didn't want to survive. I wanted to live. And I wanted to win. My voice didn't shake. Not once. It was steady. Clear. Strong. I continued. To anyone who's ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to stop dreaming, I hope you hear this loud and clear. They were wrong. Your voice matters. Your dreams matter. You matter. Applause broke out before I finished. But I kept going. And to the ones who underestimated us, thank you. Because you taught us how to rise. Even when no one's clapping. Now I looked up. Straight ahead. Straight into his eyes. And I smiled. The applause was deafening. I stepped back from the microphone. Someone shook my hand. Another handed me a rolled diploma, but I barely felt it. My eyes were locked on him. He looked like he'd swallowed glass. His jaw was clenched. His eyes slightly wider than usual, but still trying to maintain that cold, unreadable mask. But it cracked. Right there in front of everyone, my father's expression cracked for just a second. That second was everything. It was louder than applause. It was longer than any speech. It was the moment I took back my name, my worth, my story. I walked down the steps. The air tasted different. I had made him watch. And I wasn't done yet. I didn't look back when I stepped off the stage. I didn't need to. I had seen what I needed to see. One look at his face told me everything. The rigid jaw, the barely parted lips, the stunned silence as the crowd erupted. I could almost hear his thoughts cracking beneath the surface. He had expected me to disappear. He had expected me to fail. And yet there I was, being cheered by hundreds, wearing the robe he never thought I'd earn, holding a diploma he never believed I'd touch. I moved through the crowd like I was floating. People reached out to shake my hand, to congratulate me, but I barely registered them. The moment was suspended around me like mist. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I could still see his face in my mind, frozen in that single frame, the split-second collapse of his certainty. That look wasn't just surprise. It was fear. Fear that I had become someone beyond his control. Fear that I no longer needed him. Fear that the daughter he discarded was now untouchable. I found a quiet spot behind the building where the noise couldn't reach. I leaned against the wall, letting the sun warm my skin. I hadn't cried in years, not since the night I left home with a backpack and no plan. But now, standing there with the echoes of applause still bouncing in my chest, I felt something rise. Not tears. Not pain. Just a quiet, immense relief. I had made it. And not just to the stage but out. Out of the silence. Out of the prison of his words. Out of the shadow of who he tried to make me believe I was. I didn't expect them to come looking for me after the ceremony. But they did. My mother found me first. She walked hesitantly, clutching her purse with both hands like a child. Her hair was grayer now, her face thinner. I wondered for a moment if I had made her suffer by inviting them. But the thought passed. She had made her choices too. She stopped a few steps away, eyes flicking to the diploma I still held. "You were incredible," she said softly. "Your speech." Everyone was surprised. I finished for her. "That I didn't vanish like you all expected?" She flinched but didn't deny it. That silence, familiar and sharp, settled between us. "You look so much like me," she said as if it hurt her. I looked her in the eyes. "I'm nothing like you." She nodded slowly. And then, barely above a whisper, "I know." Before she could say anything else, he appeared. Thomas Graves. My father. Standing just behind her, hands behind his back like he was inspecting a gallery. His face was unreadable again, stone carved into flesh. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at me and I looked back. There was a moment, long and stretched, where the air between us was filled with everything he never said. Every dismissal. Every time he chose Nathan. Every time he walked past me like I was air. Finally he said, "That speech was impressive. Not moving. Not true. Not, I'm proud. Just impressive." I smiled. Not out of joy. Out of confirmation. That was all he had to give. And it wasn't enough. "I didn't write it for you," I said. "I know," he replied. "But you knew we'd come." "No," I said, "I hoped you would. So you could finally see the difference between silence and strength." He opened his mouth to say something, but I stepped forward. "You tried to erase me," I said. "Every time you ignored me. Every time you lifted Nathan higher while pretending I didn't exist. But I was watching. I was remembering. Every moment you thought you broke me, I was building something stronger." He didn't speak. He couldn't. I handed him the invitation envelope I had saved, the same one I'd mailed weeks ago. He took it without a word, looking down at it like it was something unfamiliar. "You can keep it," I said. "A souvenir. Of the day you realized you don't own the ending." Then I turned and walked away. I didn't need to hear what they said. I didn't need their apologies. The power was never in their words. It was in mine. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to use them. I left them standing there. The man who taught me silence and the woman who survived beside him by becoming silent herself. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me I wanted to reclaim. No final conversation, no last reconciliation, no desperate attempt at a bridge over a sea of fire. Some things are not meant to be rebuilt. Some ruins are sacred. That night the world felt different. I wasn't a student anymore. I wasn't someone waiting to become something. I was already it. I was proof that you could escape a graveyard and carry your name like a banner instead of a burden. I sat alone on the roof of my apartment, watching the lights of the city flicker like fireflies below. My phone buzzed endlessly. Messages, congratulations, offers for interviews, calls I didn't return. But one message stood out. Nathan. I hadn't heard from him in years. Not since I left. He hadn't tried to find me. I used to wonder if he cared. Now I wondered if he even knew how to care. His message was short. "I saw the video. You were amazing. Dad's been quiet all day." That was it. No apology. No questions. Just acknowledgement. Still, it made something shift in me. Maybe because he had always been a part of that world, too. Maybe because, deep down, I had wanted someone, anyone, to notice the fight it took just to stand on that stage. I didn't respond. The next few days passed like a slow exhale. I packed my things, turned in my keys, and said my goodbyes. Everyone talked about beginnings, about life after college, about possibilities. I listened politely, but part of me felt like I had already lived through the climax of my story. Everything after this felt like an echo. But I knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the first chapter one got to write myself. I moved to a new city, started a fellowship with a nonprofit that helped young women who had aged out of foster care. Most of them had stories that curled the edges of your soul. But they weren't broken. They were sharp, resilient, dangerous in the best way. I saw parts of myself in them, especially the ones who had perfected the art of not being seen. At night I wrote. Pages and pages. I didn't know if it would become a book or a memoir or just therapy bound in paper. I didn't care. The words came like blood finally finding its way back to the heart. I wrote about pain. About vanishing. About choosing to exist anyway. Then one afternoon nearly a year after graduation I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A letter. From my mother. It was handwritten, folded carefully as if the paper itself might bruise. There were no flowers, no return address. Just my name. Inside were 3 sentences. You were right. I knew, but I stayed. I'm sorry I made you grow up thinking that love was quiet. That was all. And somehow it was more than I ever expected. I didn't cry. I didn't call her. I placed the letter in a small box where I kept pieces of my past. Not because I wanted to return to it, but because some memories deserve to be kept under lock and key. Not burned. Not erased. Just contained. People say revenge is bitter, that it never truly satisfies. But I disagree. Revenge, when done right, isn't about destruction. It's about resurrection. It's about rebuilding yourself so loudly that the people who doubted you have no choice but to listen. And I was just getting started. The months that followed were a blur of interviews, speaking engagements, and invitations to panels I never imagined I'd be part of. Suddenly, the girl who once feared silence was commanding rooms full of people who wanted to hear her story. Every time I spoke, I told them about the cracks in the facade, the invisible wounds left by those who were supposed to protect us, and the fire that comes from choosing to rise anyway. But fame was a strange thing. It wasn't what I thought it would be. It wasn't a magical shield against pain or a ticket to forgiveness. It was a mirror reflecting every scar, every failure, every moment I tried to pretend I was okay when I wasn't. The spotlight burned, but it also exposed the parts of me I wanted to keep hidden. I learned quickly that the world loves a survivor, but it's less kind to a woman who speaks of her father's cruelty. Some called me brave. Others whispered that I was bitter. There were nights I stared at my reflection and wondered if I was becoming the thing I hated most. Someone defined by pain. Nathan reached out again, this time with something different. He asked to meet. I hesitated, the old fear tightening its grip for a moment, but then I agreed. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a desire to finally close the gap between the brother I thought I knew and the man who'd been caught in the same storm. We met in a cafe that smelled of coffee and old books. He looked older than I remembered, shadows beneath his eyes, a nervous smile that didn't reach his mouth. I want to understand, he said quietly. I studied him. Understand what? What happened? Why you left? Why it broke us all? I nodded slowly. It's not a simple story, Nathan. And it's not just about what happened to me. It's about what didn't happen to any of us. For the first time I saw something shift in him. A crack in the armor. A spark of something I hadn't seen before. Maybe hope. Maybe guilt. We talked for hours, unraveling memories, sharing pain, and sometimes just sitting in silence. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was beginning. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt lighter. Not because the past was gone, but because I had taken the first step to rewrite the future. But even as I moved forward, I knew the journey wasn't over. My father's shadow still lingered. Not as a chain, but as a challenge. A challenge to keep rising, keep fighting, keep proving that the story doesn't end where others want it to. And this time I wasn't just surviving. I was winning. After that meeting with Nathan, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I believed that understanding, even the fragile, painful kind, could start to mend the fractures of our past. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. Not long after, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was hesitant but unmistakably his. My father. Emily, he said, voice low and cautious. We need to talk. I froze. Years of silence flooded back. Every cold glance, every ignored birthday, every whispered moment I thought would never end. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream. But part of me, deep down, wanted to hear what he had to say. We agreed to meet at a neutral place. A small cafe halfway between his home and mine. When I walked in, his eyes were the same, hard, unreadable, but there was something else too. Vulnerability. Or maybe regret. I'm not here to apologize, he began. Not yet. But I want to understand. I know I failed you. I know I failed Anna. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to try to fix this, whatever this is now. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man who'd haunted my childhood was capable of change. But years of neglect don't just disappear overnight. I looked at him, searching for the father I never had, but all I saw was a stranger. "I've spent years building a life without you," I said softly. "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds. I came because I need to hear from you if you're really willing to listen." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I am." For hours we talked. Not just about the past, but about the future. About who we might be if we dared to break the cycle. It wasn't easy. It wasn't neat. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. But it was a start. That day marked a turning point. Not because everything was fixed, but because I realized that vengeance wasn't the only way forward. Sometimes victory is simply choosing to move on. The weeks after our meeting were a strange limbo. Neither reconciliation nor distance. My father didn't flood me with calls, nor did he vanish completely. He sent an email here and there, careful, measured, like a man learning to walk again after years in the dark. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of me was skeptical. Part of me wanted desperately to believe this was the beginning of something real. I stayed cautious, reminding myself that hope could be just another kind of pain. Meanwhile, my work with the nonprofit flourished. I poured my energy into those young women, hearing their stories that echoed mine in so many ways. Their resilience became my fuel. They didn't have time for bitterness. They had futures to claim. One evening, after a long day of meetings and writing, I sat on my apartment floor, a letter unopened on the table. It was from Nathan. He'd invited me to an event, a memorial for our mother. I hadn't seen him since that coffee shop meeting months ago. The idea of facing him again, of stepping into the shadow of our past, shook me. But I knew I had to go. The night of the memorial, the room was filled with faces I hadn't seen in years. Family, friends, distant relatives, people who remembered Anna as more than the ghost she'd become. The air was thick with stories, laughter, tears, and memories. Nathan found me near the back, eyes soft but guarded. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. I nodded. "Me too." We talked about Mom, her kindness, her struggles, the love she tried to hold together even as it slipped through her fingers. It was the first time I felt truly connected to that part of my history, the part before the silence. Later my father arrived. He didn't seek me out. He stayed in the corner, watching, waiting. I wondered what he was thinking, if guilt gnawed at him or if it was something colder. When the memorial ended, I stood outside, the night air sharp and clear. Nathan joined me, silent for a moment. "Do you think he's really trying?" he asked. I looked up at the stars. "I don't know. But I'm willing to find out." For the first time, the past didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a bridge. Fragile, uneven, but real. The days after the memorial brought an unexpected calm. For the first time in years, I felt like I was navigating a world where the past didn't clutch me so tightly. The fragile truce between me and my father remained unspoken but present, an uneasy peace settling over our fractured family. I threw myself deeper into my work, leading workshops and mentoring girls who had known silence in their own ways. Their stories haunted me but also inspired me. I became their voice when they had none, and in doing so, I found strength I hadn't realized I possessed. Yet despite the progress, shadows lingered. At night, memories would claw their way to the surface. Those cold dinners where I was invisible, the whispered comparisons to Nathan, the weight of my father's disappointment pressing down like a stone. Some nights, the silence was louder than ever, echoing the years I spent wondering if I mattered at all. Then one afternoon a letter arrived, this time from my father. No apology, just words carefully chosen, admitting mistakes, acknowledging pain, and asking for a chance to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. I responded cautiously, inviting him to meet again, hoping that time could mend more than just wounds, but also walls built from years of neglect. Our conversations grew slowly, from awkward phone calls to tentative meetings over coffee, then dinners where we talked about things other than the past. We spoke about mundane things, books, the weather, news stories. Little by little, he revealed pieces of himself I hadn't known existed. A man burdened by regrets and lost chances. It was hard to reconcile the image of my father, the tyrant who crushed my dreams, with this fragile, searching man who now sat across from me, vulnerable and open. I realized that vengeance had its place, but so did healing. Healing was messy. Healing was painful. But it was also necessary. Through this, I began writing again, not just for myself but for others. Stories of survival, resilience, and the complexity of family. My words reached far beyond my little circle, resonating with people who had their own shadows to confront. But even as I moved forward, the past was never far behind. The wounds my father had inflicted weren't easily erased, and sometimes they bled into my present when I least expected. Still, I was learning to live with the scars, not as chains but as reminders of how far I'd come. And for the first time I believed I could write my own ending. Months slipped by like pages turning too fast in a book I was eager to read but reluctant to finish. Each day I balanced the precarious tightrope between the woman I had become and the girl I once was. The one who learned to hide in silence, who believed she was invisible and unworthy. The scars my father left didn't vanish overnight, but I was learning to carry them like badges of survival rather than chains of defeat. Our conversations, once stiff and measured, grew warmer and more natural. I found myself sharing parts of my life I had long locked away. He listened, not with the cold detachment I had known but with genuine, cautious interest. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the man my mother once saw, the man beneath the mask of control and distance. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was enough to begin the fragile process of forgiveness. I took to writing daily, each word a step forward, a piece of my story laid bare for the world to see. My book, once a private catharsis, started attracting attention. Invitations to speak, interviews, even offers to collaborate on documentaries. Suddenly, Emily Graves wasn't just a name on a diploma. She was a symbol, a beacon for those who had lived in the shadows of their own families, waiting for light. Yet with every public appearance, with every spotlight, the old fears crept back in. Would I be reduced again to the girl who wasn't good enough? Would my father's voice echo in the ears of strangers, drowning out my own? The battle wasn't just external. It was a war within, a constant struggle between vulnerability and strength. One evening, after a particularly draining interview, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at a photo from my childhood. A rare moment captured in time. My mother smiling softly, Nathan laughing, and me, standing slightly apart, clutching a crumpled drawing, eyes wide and searching. The memory was bittersweet. It reminded me of what I'd lost, but also of how far I'd come. I realized that my story wasn't just about vengeance or survival. It was about transformation. About the power to rewrite the narrative, to claim agency over a life once dictated by silence and neglect. And that was the true victory. Because in the end, winning wasn't about making my father watch me succeed. It was about learning to forgive myself. About building a life where his voice no longer had the power to define me. I closed the photo album and took a deep breath. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time I held the pen. The morning after that night, I woke with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The heavy weight of my past didn't vanish. It never would completely, but it felt lighter somehow, like a storm finally breaking and giving way to clear skies. I made coffee in silence, watching the steam curl from the mug, thinking about everything that had led me here. My phone buzzed. An email from a producer interested in turning my story into a documentary. They wanted to capture the journey from silence to voice, from victim to victor. It was surreal, and for a moment I hesitated. Exposing my life felt risky, like opening a wound that was still healing. But then I remembered why I started writing in the first place. To give a voice to those who felt unheard. I agreed. Filming began weeks later. Cameras followed me through workshops, interviews, quiet moments alone with my thoughts. It was strange watching myself from the outside, seeing the cracks, the pain, but also the fire. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or made to feel invisible. My father watched the first screening. He sat in the back of a small theater, his face unreadable as the lights dimmed and my life unfolded on the screen. When it ended, he stayed seated long after the applause had faded. I caught his eye, and for the first time I saw something I'd never seen before, regret mixed with awe. Afterwards he approached me quietly. "You were brave," he said. "I was wrong." Those words didn't erase years of pain, but they were a beginning. A crack in the wall that had separated us for so long. Our relationship remained complicated, filled with moments of tension and tentative understanding. But through it all, I held on to one truth. I was no longer defined by his silence or his anger. I was defined by my own voice, my own choices. The documentary premiered to critical acclaim. Letters poured in from strangers who found hope in my story. Women who said they finally felt seen. Young girls who dared to dream despite their circumstances. Me. I kept writing, speaking, living. Because winning wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life. And finally owning my story. The release of the documentary opened a new chapter in my life. One I hadn't fully anticipated. Suddenly, Emily Graves was no longer just a woman who survived her past. She was a symbol, a voice for countless others who had lived in shadows too long. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Letters, emails, and messages flooded my inbox daily. Stories of pain, resilience, and hope. Women writing to say that my journey inspired them to speak their own truths, to break free from the silence that had held them captive. At first I was humbled. Then I was terrified. Because with visibility came expectations. With influence came responsibility. And with responsibility came the realization that my healing was not just personal. It was public. Every word I spoke, every story I shared, was now a thread woven into a tapestry much larger than myself. I traveled to conferences and events, sometimes speaking before crowds of thousands. Each time I told the story of the little girl who was ignored, dismissed, and silenced, and how that girl grew up to reclaim her voice. But as the applause faded, I found myself wrestling with a question I hadn't anticipated. Who was I beyond this story? Beyond the pain and the survival? What did victory really mean? One evening, after a particularly intense talk, I found myself alone in my hotel room, the city lights glittering beyond the window. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was strong, yes, but also tired, fragile beneath the surface. I wondered if I was losing myself in the story, if I was becoming a version of myself dictated by the narrative I'd created. That night I began writing again. Not speeches, not essays, but letters. Letters to my younger self, letters to my father, letters to the women who looked to me for strength. Writing became a way to reclaim my identity beyond survivor, beyond symbol. It was messy and raw, filled with contradictions and doubts, but it was honest. In the midst of this personal journey, my relationship with my father remained complex. We spoke more often now, sometimes daily, other times weeks apart. There were moments of progress, shared meals, laughter even, and moments of tension, silences heavy enough to crush bones. He was trying, that much was clear. But old wounds don't heal in straight lines. Sometimes they reopen without warning. One afternoon I visited his home for the first time in years. The house was smaller than I remembered, worn around the edges, but filled with echoes of the past. We sat in the living room, sipping tea, the air thick with unspoken words. He apologized again, not just for what he had done to me but for the man he had failed to be. I accepted the apology, though the weight of years didn't disappear instantly. That visit was a turning point. It didn't erase the past, but it allowed us to acknowledge it, and that acknowledgement was the foundation for something new. Meanwhile, my writing was evolving. I began working on a memoir, diving deeper into the raw, unvarnished truth of my experiences. The process was painful but necessary. I confronted demons I had long avoided, revisiting moments of fear, betrayal, and loneliness. But I also celebrated resilience, hope, and the unbreakable human spirit. The memoir took over my life. Late nights turned into early mornings. Coffee became my constant companion. Every sentence was a battle between vulnerability and strength, between exposing pain and protecting myself. But with each page I felt lighter, more whole. As the manuscript neared completion, I received news that a major publishing house was interested. The idea of sharing my story with the world in this new form was exhilarating and terrifying. I knew the book would reach places the documentary couldn't. Quiet bedrooms, hidden corners, places where people lived with their own silence. And I hoped my words would be a lifeline. Through it all, I never lost sight of the truth that had carried me from a silent child to a woman commanding her own narrative. Victory is not a destination. It is a journey. It is messy, complicated, and often uncertain. But it is ours to claim. And this was my victory. The weeks that followed the book deal announcement were a whirlwind. Suddenly, my private pain was becoming public property, something that could be bought and sold, read and judged. The thought terrified me. I spent nights wondering if I was ready to bare my soul to the world once more. But I reminded myself that this wasn't just my story, it was theirs too. The countless women who had whispered their own truths in the dark, waiting for a voice like mine to break the silence. I dived into writing with renewed purpose. The memoir demanded honesty I hadn't yet dared to give. I sifted through memories, sometimes raw and jagged, sometimes softened by distance. I wrote about the cold dinners, the unspoken comparisons, the nights I cried alone in my room, feeling like a ghost in my own family. I wrote about the turning points, the day I left, the speech at graduation, the fragile attempts at reconciliation. Every sentence was a reckoning. But writing was also a release. Each page freed a part of me that had been trapped for years. I allowed myself to feel the anger, the hurt, the confusion, and then to let it go. It was painful and liberating all at once. The process forced me to confront my father again, not as the tyrant of my youth, but as a flawed man struggling with his own demons. I wrote about his silence, his absence, but also about the moments he surprised me, the rare apologies, the attempts to bridge a chasm that sometimes felt bottomless. As the manuscript grew, so did my platform. I was invited to speak at universities, on podcasts, and at conferences worldwide. People shared how my story touched them, how it gave them courage to face their own struggles. The responsibility weighed heavily, but it also fueled my resolve. One evening, after a talk in a packed auditorium, a woman approached me. She was older, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your story saved me." That moment stayed with me. It reminded me why I had chosen this path, not for fame or recognition, but to be a beacon in the darkness for those still lost. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father continued to evolve. We still stumbled through misunderstandings and silences, but beneath it all was a fragile bond rebuilding itself. We talked about the future, tentative plans for family gatherings, calls that lasted longer than before, shared memories that no longer felt like weapons. Yet I knew healing was not linear. Some days the past would crash into the present like a wave, pulling me under. But I was learning to swim. The memoir was finally complete. Holding the finished manuscript in my hands, I felt a surge of accomplishment and vulnerability. This was more than a book. It was a testament to survival, resilience, and the power of reclaiming one's voice. As I prepared for its release, I realized something profound. My story wasn't just about me. It was about all of us who had been told we didn't matter, who had been silenced and overlooked, and who had found the courage to rise anyway. And in telling my story, I found not just my voice, but my purpose. The release of the memoir marked a new phase, not just for me but for the story itself. Suddenly, Emily Graves was more than a name. She was a movement. Letters poured in from readers who saw themselves in my words. Women who had endured neglect, invisibility, and silence. Some wrote to thank me for giving them hope. Others shared stories of pain I hadn't known existed, stories that echoed my own in ways that made my heart ache. With every message, I felt a growing responsibility. I wasn't just telling my story anymore. I was holding a mirror to the hidden wounds many carry. It was both humbling and terrifying. I traveled to book signings, interviews, and panel discussions. Each event was a reminder that the fight wasn't just mine. It was universal. I met women who had been silenced for decades, girls who were just beginning their own journeys, and men who had witnessed the damage of silence in their families and communities. But despite the accolades, the internal battle persisted. I struggled with the fear that my past would define me forever. That no matter how much I achieved, the shadow of my father's rejection would follow me like a ghost. One afternoon, a call came that shook me to my core. Nathan had been in an accident. The news hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, all the years of distance and pain felt irrelevant. He was my brother. And he needed me. I rushed to the hospital, heart pounding, mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Seeing him hooked up to machines, pale but alive, stirred something fierce inside me. The fragile bond we had was put to the ultimate test. In the days that followed, I sat by his bedside, talking to him, holding his hand, promising that we would face whatever came next, together. The experience shattered walls I didn't know I'd built around my heart. It reminded me that family, no matter how fractured, can still be a source of healing. As Nathan recovered, I found myself reflecting on my own journey. The revenge that once fueled me, the forgiveness I had slowly embraced, and the love I was beginning to reclaim. It wasn't a perfect story. It wasn't neat or tidy. But it was real. And real was enough. The days that followed Nathan's accident were some of the most turbulent I had ever lived through. Seeing my brother, the person who for so long had been a stranger to me, trapped to machines fighting for his life, opened a deep wound, a mixture of fear, anger, love, and guilt that I didn't know how to manage. For years, silence and grudges had separated us, and now, suddenly, the fragility of life forced us to confront what we had avoided for so long. Visits to the hospital became routine, and each day as he slowly regained strength, our connection also grew stronger. We talked about everything: the past, the losses, the mistakes we made, and the chances we might still have to repair what had been broken. It wasn't easy. Often, words got lost along the way, and the silence between us was as heavy as any argument. I realized that although the wound between my father and me was deep, the relationship with Nathan had its own scars. He had grown up with the shadow of our father's favoritism hanging over us, and that shaped who he was just as it shaped me. Yet now, in that cold hospital room, we discovered that we were more than the pain we shared. We were survivors trying to find a new path together. While Nathan fought to recover, I found myself reflecting on my own journey. The revenge that had consumed me for so long had given me strength, but it had also left me empty in many moments. The transformation I began wasn't just about exposing the past but about building a future where I would not be defined by it. I began writing again, but this time, not just to recount pain, but to explore the complexity of forgiveness, redemption, and family love, even when imperfect. I wrote letters I never sent to my father, to Nathan, and even to myself as a way to organize my thoughts and feelings. The process was painful. Many times the pain felt like a raging sea threatening to drown me, but it was also an ocean of possibilities, the space where healing could happen. Gradually, I learned to allow myself to feel without fear, to embrace vulnerability as strength, and to accept that the past didn't have to dictate my destiny. The media followed my work closely, and interest in my book grew as did the expectations. There were days when the weight of fame and responsibility crushed me, but I clung to the truth that my voice could be the difference in someone's life. That gave me strength to keep going. Amid all this, my father was also going through his own journey. I heard he was facing health problems, and that made me confront contradictory feelings: resentment, fear, concern. The distance between us seemed to shrink, even though the right words were still hard to find. In a gesture I never imagined, he sent me a handwritten letter admitting his mistakes and expressing a desire to repair what he had destroyed. I read that letter countless times, each word echoing like a silent plea for reconciliation. I decided to respond, not with grand words but with the honesty I had built over the years. I spoke about my wounds, my limits, but also about the hope I still kept in my heart. In the meetings that followed, we talked as never before. We discovered that healing isn't a straight line but a winding path requiring patience, courage, and above all, love, even if imperfect. Meanwhile, Nathan resumed his life with renewed strength. The accident, tragic as it was, became a turning point. He dedicated himself to helping youth in difficult situations, inspired by the stories we shared. Seeing my brother like that filled me with pride and a deep feeling of redemption. I, for my part, continued to write, speak, and fight so no one else would have to live in the shadow of silence. My book became a bestseller, and I received invitations to lectures around the world. Every story I heard reinforced the importance of what I did, and every woman who approached to thank me reminded me the struggle was worth it. But deep down, I knew the greatest victory wasn't in the words I wrote or the applause I received. It was in the internal transformation, in the ability to look at the past with compassion, to accept my imperfections, and to love my family, flaws and all. The revenge that once fueled my anger transformed into the strength to heal. The silence that imprisoned me broke with my voice, and the fear that paralyzed me gave way to courage. I was no longer that invisible, ignored, and despised girl. I was Emily Graves, a woman with a firm voice, an open heart, and her own story. And finally, I was free. If you want me to continue translating or proceed with the next parts, just let me know. The weeks after Nathan's recovery were a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Watching him regain his strength was a gift, but it also forced us to face the realities we'd long ignored. The fractured pieces of our family, the shadows that still lingered, and the fragile thread of trust we were slowly weaving back together. For so many years, I had defined myself by the silence and neglect, by the cold distance of a father who never seemed to love me enough, and by the absence of a brother who was both protector and rival. But now, in these quiet moments beside Nathan's hospital bed and later in the small apartment he moved into, I saw a new possibility, a future where we could be more than our scars. Nathan and I spent countless hours talking about everything we had missed. The birthdays, the holidays, the simple daily moments we never shared. There was anger too, of course, and pain, but beneath it all, a growing determination to rebuild. It wasn't easy. Healing rarely is. Sometimes old wounds bled anew. Sometimes words spoken in frustration cut deeper than years of silence. But we learned to forgive, not just each other but ourselves. Around that time, I received news that my memoir was slated for publication early next year. The thought terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. I'd poured my soul into those pages, bearing my truth to a world that might judge, pity, or misunderstand. But I also knew that my story was more than my pain. It was a beacon for those still lost in darkness. The weeks leading up to publication were filled with interviews, edits, and endless questions. I became a spokesperson not just for my own journey but for the countless others who had suffered in silence. It was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself alone in my apartment, staring out at the city lights. The noise and chaos of my public life felt distant, replaced by a quiet longing for normalcy. A family dinner, a simple conversation without subtext or pain. I called Nathan. We talked for hours, laughing and reminiscing, dreaming about the future. For the first time, it felt like we were truly brothers again, not just by blood but by choice. My relationship with my father continued to evolve in its slow, imperfect way. We shared moments of genuine connection, small victories that felt monumental after years of silence. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we sat in silence, each lost in thought. But we were trying, and that was enough. As the publication date approached, I felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. Would the world accept my story? Would it change anything? The day the memoir hit the shelves was surreal. I held the first printed copy in my hands, the weight of years of pain and perseverance bound in ink and paper. I thought of the little girl who once believed she was invisible and unworthy. I hoped she would find strength in these pages. The response was overwhelming. Readers from all walks of life reached out, sharing how the book had touched them, how it had given them hope and courage. I realized then that my story had become more than my own. It was a collective story of survival and resilience. Through it all, I learned that healing is not a destination but a journey. It's messy, complicated, and often uncertain. But it's ours to walk step by step. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer a prisoner of my past. I was the author of my own story. And this time I was writing it on my own terms. The months following the release of my memoir were a whirlwind of emotions and experiences that I had never anticipated. The book had connected me with countless people who had lived through similar pain, and for the first time, I felt part of a larger community bound by shared struggle and resilience. Yet this newfound visibility also brought its own challenges, exposing vulnerabilities I had kept hidden for years. Public speaking engagements became a regular part of my life. I traveled from city to city, sharing my story, hoping that my voice could inspire others to break free from their own chains of silence. Each event was both exhausting and exhilarating, a reminder of why I had chosen this path. The faces of those who listened, their tears, nods, and occasional smiles, became a balm for my soul. Despite the support, I struggled with the fear that my past would forever define me. Sometimes I found myself slipping into old patterns of doubt and insecurity, wondering if I was enough or if my story was merely a tragic tale with no real happy ending. Those nights were the hardest, when the applause faded and I was left alone with my thoughts. Through it all, my relationship with Nathan deepened. Our shared history, once a source of pain, had become a foundation for healing. We spoke openly about our fears and hopes, about the father who had shaped us in ways both cruel and complicated. Nathan's presence was a steady reminder that family could be reclaimed, rebuilt, and redefined. My father remained a complex figure in my life. We navigated a delicate dance of connection and distance. Some days brought breakthroughs, small moments of understanding and kindness. Others brought setbacks, old wounds reopened and words spoken in anger. But even in the hardest moments, I knew that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. Writing continued to be my refuge. I began working on a follow-up book, one that explored the themes of healing and redemption beyond my personal story. The process was both cathartic and challenging, pushing me to confront uncomfortable truths and expand my understanding of resilience. One afternoon, I received a letter from a reader that stayed with me long after I read it. She wrote about escaping an abusive relationship and finding strength in my words. Her gratitude was a poignant reminder of the power of storytelling to transform lives. As I reflected on my journey, I understood that my story was not just about overcoming the past but about embracing the complexity of human experience. The pain, the hope, the failures, and the triumphs. It was about choosing to live authentically despite the scars. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time I faced it with a sense of peace and purpose. I was no longer defined by the silence that once consumed me but by the voice I had fought so hard to reclaim. And in that voice I found freedom. The transition from chaos to calm was never a straight line. Healing felt more like walking through a dense forest with no clear path, each step forward sometimes met by an unexpected obstacle. Yet as Nathan regained his strength and independence, I found myself confronting my own fears about what the future held for us, for our family, and for me. I often thought about how our lives had been shaped by silence and distance, the unspoken resentments, the missed chances, the walls built from years of neglect. But in those moments of reflection, I also recognized the fragile threads of hope woven through our shared history. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rewrite the story we'd been handed. With Nathan's recovery came new conversations, deeper, more honest than anything we'd shared before. We spoke about the pain we'd both endured, about the complicated love that still bound us despite everything. Sometimes we laughed at memories long buried. Other times tears came unbidden as we acknowledged wounds that still needed tending. Our relationship was no longer defined by the past but by the deliberate choices we made each day to connect, to forgive, to support. It was imperfect, messy, but real. Meanwhile, my public life continued to expand. The memoir's release opened doors I hadn't dared to imagine. Speaking engagements, interviews, invitations to collaborate on projects focused on healing and empowerment. Each opportunity was a reminder of the responsibility I carried, not just to tell my story but to amplify the voices of those still silenced. I started working with organizations dedicated to supporting survivors of familial neglect and abuse, lending my experience and voice to help shape programs that offered real change. The work was demanding but fulfilling, grounding me in purpose beyond personal healing. Yet behind the scenes I wrestled with moments of doubt. The fear that I wasn't enough, that my story would be forgotten or worse, misunderstood. Those nights were the hardest, when the facade of strength faltered and I was left alone with my thoughts and insecurities. In those moments I turned to writing, not for the world but for myself. Letters to my younger self, journals filled with unfiltered emotions, poetry that captured the contradictions within me. Writing became both sanctuary and compass, guiding me through the uncertainty. One particularly quiet evening, as I poured my thoughts onto the page, I realized something profound. Healing was not about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about embracing it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and choosing how to move forward with intention. My relationship with my father remained a complex tapestry. Some days brought breakthroughs, calls filled with warmth, shared memories, tentative plans for the holidays. Other days brought silence or tension, reminders that the road to forgiveness is rarely linear. But I clung to the moments of connection, no matter how fleeting, as proof that change was possible. As the seasons changed, so did I. I embraced the imperfections of my journey, recognizing that strength was not the absence of vulnerability but the courage to face it head-on. And through it all, I knew one truth. I was no longer defined by the shadows of my past. I was the author of my own story, one of resilience, love, and unyielding hope. The quiet moments between the chaos of public life were when I often found myself reflecting most deeply. It was in the stillness of my apartment, long after the cameras had been turned off and the applause had faded, that the true weight of my journey settled in. There, alone with my thoughts, I faced the complexities that no interview or speech could fully capture. I thought about my father, the man whose absence and coldness had shaped so much of my pain. Our relationship was a fragile thread stretched thin over years of misunderstandings and hurt. Yet despite everything, there remained a yearning for connection, for some semblance of the family I had once dreamed of. Forgiveness was a distant mountain I was still climbing, but every step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Nathan, too, was a living testament to the power of resilience. Watching him navigate his recovery with quiet strength filled me with a mixture of pride and humility. Our shared history, once a source of division, was slowly becoming the foundation of a renewed bond. We talked openly now, about the past, our fears, and hopes for the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. The memoir continued to open doors, each one leading to new conversations and unexpected connections. I traveled to cities I'd only dreamed of visiting, speaking at conferences and workshops where people listened not just to my story, but to the universal themes of pain, healing, and hope. Each audience brought new faces and new voices, reminding me that I was part of a larger movement, one that demanded honesty, courage, and compassion. But with visibility came vulnerability. The more I shared, the more I exposed myself to judgment and scrutiny. There were days when I questioned if I was strong enough, if my voice was truly making a difference. The fear of being reduced to my trauma, or worse, being forgotten, lingered like a shadow at the edges of my mind. In those moments, I turned inward, finding solace in the simple acts of writing and reflection. I filled journals with letters I never sent, words meant for my younger self, for my father, and for Nathan. Writing became a lifeline, a way to process the swirling emotions that often felt overwhelming. One day, during a particularly difficult week, I received a message from a woman named Sarah. She shared her own story of family betrayal and the long road to healing. Her words resonated deeply, reminding me that my story was not just my own, but a beacon for others navigating their own darkness. That connection reignited my commitment to the work I was doing. I realized that while the path was fraught with pain and uncertainty, it was also filled with moments of profound beauty and transformation. Back home, the seasons shifted, and with them came a sense of renewal. I found joy in the small things: a shared meal with Nathan, a quiet morning spent writing, the warmth of sunlight streaming through my window. These moments grounded me, reminding me that life was a collection of fleeting, precious instants. As I prepared for my next speaking engagement, I felt a growing sense of peace. I was no longer defined solely by my past or the wounds it left behind. Instead, I was embracing the full spectrum of my experience: the pain and the triumph, the darkness and the light. The journey was far from over, but I was ready to face whatever came next with open eyes and an open heart. And in that readiness I found strength. The deeper I delved into sharing my story, the more I realized how intertwined my personal healing was with the healing of others. Each time I spoke, I felt the invisible threads that connected me to countless others. People burdened by silence, pain, and the desperate need for understanding. It was humbling and terrifying to know that my words carried such weight, but it also gave me purpose beyond anything I had imagined. One evening, after a long day of interviews and meetings, I sat alone in my hotel room, exhaustion creeping in. The silence was deafening. I thought back to the little girl I once was, quiet, unseen, desperate for love and approval. How far I had come, and yet how fragile that journey still felt. Despite the strength I projected, inside I still wrestled with fear, self-doubt, and the scars left by years of neglect. The memoir's success opened doors, but it also exposed me to the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Some people saw me as a symbol of resilience. Others viewed me as a victim to be pitied. Navigating those perceptions was a constant challenge. I reminded myself that my truth was mine to own, no matter how others chose to interpret it. Nathan became my anchor during those turbulent times. His presence was steady and reassuring. We spent long evenings talking about our shared past and our hopes for the future. We acknowledged the wounds that remained but also celebrated the progress we'd made. Rebuilding our sibling bond wasn't easy. It required patience, honesty, and forgiveness, but it was worth every difficult conversation. My father's health declined slowly but noticeably. The man who once seemed so distant and unreachable was now vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our conversations became tinged with a new urgency, a desire to mend what had been broken before time ran out. It was awkward and uncomfortable at times, but it also opened the door to a tentative reconciliation. One afternoon, I visited him in the hospital. The sterile smell, the beeping machines, everything felt surreal. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile. We talked quietly, not about the past but about small things: the weather, books, memories from when I was a child. It was a fragile moment of connection, but it meant more than words could express. The experience forced me to confront complex feelings: guilt, resentment, hope, and love all tangled together. It wasn't a clean or simple resolution, but it was real. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting but about accepting the imperfections of those we love. Meanwhile, my work continued to grow. I launched workshops focused on healing family trauma, helping others find their voices and reclaim their stories. The impact was profound. Hearing from participants who said my journey inspired them fueled my commitment. I also began mentoring young women, guiding them through their own struggles and encouraging them to embrace their strength. Their courage inspired me, reminding me that healing is cyclical. What we overcome can become a light for others. As the seasons turned, I found balance between my public life and private moments of rest. I learned to honor my boundaries, to say no when needed, and to prioritize my well-being. This was new territory. Self-care was no longer selfish but essential. One quiet morning, as I sipped tea and watched the sunrise, I reflected on the winding path that had brought me here. The scars of my past were still visible, but they no longer defined me. They were reminders of my resilience, my capacity to heal and grow. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time I felt ready to face it with courage and grace. Because I was no longer a victim of my past. I was the author of my own story. And my story was far from over. The days blurred together in a rhythm of travel, speaking engagements, and moments of quiet reflection. Each city I visited brought new faces, new stories, and new reminders of the universality of pain and healing. The connections I forged became lifelines, weaving a tapestry of shared experience that transcended geography and circumstance. Yet despite the outward success, I struggled with the weight of expectation. The persona I had cultivated, the woman who survived, who triumphed, sometimes felt like a mask hiding a raw and vulnerable core. Behind closed doors, I wrestled with doubts that whispered I wasn't strong enough, that my voice might one day falter. But in those moments I reminded myself of the little girl I once was. The one who longed to be seen and heard, who endured silence and neglect but never stopped dreaming of a better life. I owed it to her to keep going, to keep speaking, and to keep healing. Nathan's presence was a constant source of comfort. We navigated the complexities of our renewed relationship with patience and humor. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through setbacks. His journey was as much a part of my healing as my own. Our father's health continued to decline, and the urgency to reconcile deepened. Visits to the hospital became more frequent, and conversations that once felt impossible grew more natural. We shared moments of vulnerability, acknowledging the past without letting it dictate the present. One evening, after a particularly emotional visit, I sat alone in my room, overwhelmed by the mix of grief and hope swirling inside me. I wrote in my journal, trying to capture the paradox of loving someone who had caused so much pain. The act of writing became therapy, a way to process emotions too complex for conversation. I found solace in the pages, a private space where I could be honest without fear of judgment. As my public platform grew, so did opportunities to advocate for change. I partnered with organizations dedicated to family healing, helping to create resources and support networks for those affected by neglect and abuse. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling. Mentoring young women remained a priority. Their courage inspired me daily, reminding me that healing is not a solitary journey but a communal one. Together we found strength in shared stories and mutual support. Balancing public life with personal needs required learning to set boundaries, a challenge for someone used to pushing through pain. I embraced self-care practices and surrounded myself with a supportive circle that reminded me I didn't have to face everything alone. As the seasons shifted, I found moments of peace amidst the chaos. Early morning walks, quiet dinners with Nathan, and time spent reading helped ground me. Reflecting on my journey, I understood that healing was ongoing. It wasn't a destination but a continuous process of growth, acceptance, and resilience. And through it all, I learned that my story, though marked by pain, was also one of hope. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a warrior. Life had a way of surprising me, even when I thought I had grown accustomed to its unpredictable nature. Just as I was settling into a rhythm, balancing public appearances, personal healing, and my renewed family relationships, an unexpected letter arrived that shook me to my core. It was from my mother. I hadn't heard from her in years. Our relationship had been fractured long before the shadows cast by my father's neglect. Her silence had been another wound, one I learned to carry quietly. But here was this letter, handwritten, filled with apologies and explanations I never anticipated. She spoke of her own struggles, her fears, regrets, and the reasons she had distanced herself. The pain in her words was raw and real, a mirror to my own. For the first time, I saw her not just as the absent mother who failed me, but as a flawed woman battling her own demons. Reading that letter ignited a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, hope, and a tentative desire to reconnect. I wasn't sure if I was ready to open that door, but the possibility of healing was too important to ignore. I wrote back cautiously, sharing fragments of my own story, inviting dialogue without expectation. Our correspondence became a fragile bridge, sometimes strong, sometimes trembling under the weight of years lost. This new relationship challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Forgiving my mother felt different, more complex, intertwined with layers of abandonment and love. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd long avoided. Meanwhile, Nathan continued to be my steadfast companion. We leaned on each other, navigating this evolving family landscape with tentative optimism. The scars we bore were still visible, but so was the growing sense of unity. My memoir's impact rippled further. Invitations to speak at international events increased, and I found myself sharing stages with advocates, survivors, and leaders who inspired me. Together, we amplified messages of hope, resilience, and the power of telling one's truth. But amidst the accolades, I remained grounded by the knowledge that true healing was messy and ongoing. There were days when the weight of my past felt crushing, when old doubts crept in, threatening to undo progress. In those moments, I returned to writing by sanctuary. Pouring emotions onto the page helped me process complexities that words spoken aloud sometimes couldn't capture. The act of storytelling, I realized, was not just about sharing pain, it was about reclaiming power. And with each story told, with each connection made, I stepped further into my own strength. My relationships, once defined by silence and absence, were slowly transforming. The walls that divided us were crumbling, replaced by fragile threads of understanding. I was learning that family is not perfect. It is complicated, messy, and sometimes painful. But it is also where some of the deepest healing can happen. As the year drew to a close, I felt a deep gratitude for the journey, the lessons, and the people who walked it with me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And that was everything. As the months passed, the delicate threads of reconciliation I had been weaving began to strengthen, yet the road remained far from smooth. The echoes of the past still reverberated through our family, sometimes erupting in unexpected ways, reminding me that healing is never linear. But even in those moments of tension and pain, I found a deeper understanding of what it meant to forgive, and to be forgiven. Nathan and I grew closer, bonded not only by blood but by the trials we had endured and the choices we made to heal together. We began creating new traditions, simple acts that symbolized our renewed connection. A weekly dinner, sharing stories from our past, even laughing over inside jokes born from pain and perseverance. These small moments became the foundation for something fragile but real. My relationship with my father was still fraught with complexity. Some days his old habits of withdrawal and silence would resurface, leaving me frustrated and hurt. But I had learned to temper my expectations, to accept him as he was rather than as I wished him to be. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would surprise me. A genuine smile, a candid conversation that pierced through years of guardedness. The letters from my mother continued, each one a testament to her desire to bridge the chasm between us. Our exchanges were slow and tentative, but I sensed in them a yearning for connection that mirrored my own. Forgiving her was perhaps the hardest challenge yet, but it was a journey I was committed to, not for her sake alone, but for my own peace. As I balanced these evolving relationships, I also focused on my public work, continuing to speak, write, and advocate for those whose voices remained unheard. The platform I had built was no longer just mine. It belonged to every person who had suffered in silence and found courage through my story. Yet, amid all the progress, the scars of my past remained visible reminders of where I had been. There were nights when the weight of those memories pressed down, threatening to undo the fragile peace I had found. But I had learned to sit with that pain, to acknowledge it without letting it control me. One evening, Nathan and I sat together on the rooftop of my apartment building, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. The cool night air was filled with a quiet understanding that, despite the challenges, we had found our way back to each other. I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for a perfect family but for the imperfect, messy, and deeply human one we were rebuilding. The coming months would bring more challenges, no doubt. But I was ready. ready to face whatever came with courage, resilience, and the knowledge that I was not alone. And with that readiness came a peace I had never known. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of emotions and revelations that challenged every belief I had about family, forgiveness, and myself. As Nathan and I worked to rebuild the fragile ties that bound us, the fractures that remained in my relationship with my parents became impossible to ignore. They loomed like shadows in the background, threatening to unravel the progress we had fought so hard to make. My father's health continued to decline, and with it came a sense of urgency, a realization that time was slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. Our conversations, once hesitant and guarded, grew more honest and raw. He spoke of regrets and mistakes, of a lifetime spent wrestling with demons I had only glimpsed from afar. His vulnerability was both a balm and a burden. I struggled to reconcile the man before me with the one who had caused so much pain. The letters from my mother became more frequent, each one a window into her own struggles and a plea for understanding. Reading her words, I felt the tangled web of anger and compassion within me pull taut. Forgiving her was not a simple act. It required me to confront the wounds of abandonment and the silence that had shaped my childhood. But beneath the pain I sensed a fragile hope, a chance for healing that neither of us could afford to ignore. Meanwhile, Nathan and I found solace in our shared journey. We spent long nights talking about the past and dreaming of a future where the ghosts of our childhood no longer held sway. Our bond deepened, fortified by shared pain and a mutual commitment to break the cycle of neglect. Together we began to imagine what family could look like when built on honesty, respect, and love. Publicly, my work gained momentum. The memoir had opened doors, but it was the community I helped foster that gave me the greatest sense of purpose. I organized workshops and support groups, creating safe spaces for others to share their stories and find strength. The resilience of these individuals inspired me daily, reminding me that healing is both personal and collective. Yet amid the progress I wrestled with the fragility of it all. There were days when the weight of my past pressed heavily, when old fears and doubts whispered that I was not enough. I sought refuge in writing, allowing the words to flow as a means of understanding myself and the complex emotions that surfaced. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the rain fall, I received a call that shook me to my core. It was from my father's doctor. His condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The urgency in the doctor's voice was unmistakable. I felt a surge of emotions, fear, sorrow, unresolved tension, all crashing over me like a tidal wave. I rushed to the hospital where the sterile corridors seemed colder than ever. Seeing my father so vulnerable, surrounded by machines and monitors, was a stark reminder of life's fragility. In that moment, all the anger and resentment I had harbored seemed insignificant compared to the reality of losing him. We spoke quietly, sharing words that had long been left unsaid. I told him about my journey, my hopes, and my fears. He listened, his eyes reflecting a mix of regret and pride. For the first time I felt a true connection, a fragile bridge between past and present. The hours stretched on, filled with moments of silence and whispered conversations. I held his hand, feeling the pulse of life and the weight of years lost and reclaimed. It was a bittersweet reunion, filled with both pain and possibility. As the night wore on, I realized that forgiveness was not about erasing the past but about embracing the fullness of our shared humanity. The flaws, the failures, and the fleeting moments of grace. Leaving the hospital that night, I felt a profound shift within me. The journey I had embarked on was far from over, but I was beginning to understand that true healing comes from acceptance and love, no matter how imperfect. And with that understanding came a newfound strength, a readiness to face whatever lay ahead with an open heart. The days after that night in the hospital were some of the most introspective I had ever experienced. The stark reality of my father's fragility forced me to confront emotions I had long buried beneath layers of anger and pain. Seeing him so vulnerable, stripped of the defenses that once kept us apart, softened something inside me I hadn't realized was hardened for so long. Nathan was by my side throughout it all, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. We talked openly about the past and the complicated feelings that had shaped our family. His own struggles mirrored mine in many ways, yet we had both chosen to break free from the cycles of silence and neglect. Our conversations often drifted to what the future might hold, not just for us but for the family we hoped to rebuild. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was raw and real, filled with questions and fears, but also with tentative hope. Amid the chaos, my mother reached out again. Our correspondence had grown more frequent and sincere, though fraught with moments of hesitation and pain. Forgiveness was a winding road, and we both stumbled along it, but the desire to heal was undeniable. The memoir's impact continued to ripple through my life. I found myself invited to speak at more events, often alongside other survivors whose stories added depth and nuance to the narrative I had started. Together, we formed a chorus of voices demanding recognition, understanding, and change. Writing remained my refuge, a place where I could unravel the complexities of my emotions and experiences. Late nights were spent crafting letters I never sent, exploring the nuances of forgiveness and the meaning of family. One afternoon, as autumn leaves drifted outside my window, I received news that my father's condition had stabilized. The relief was tempered by the knowledge that time was still limited and the opportunity for deeper reconciliation fragile. I visited him often, sitting by his bedside, sharing stories, laughter, and silence. Those moments were bittersweet, filled with unspoken truths and small gestures that spoke volumes. I realized that love, in its imperfect form, was the thread weaving through our fractured family. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes painful, but it was also the source of strength and healing. Nathan and I made plans for the holidays, a symbol of new beginnings and traditions yet to be formed. The prospect of gathering around a table, sharing food and stories, filled me with cautious optimism. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the struggles, the moments of joy and connection. I was no longer the girl who felt invisible and unloved. I was a woman who had fought for her voice and found it. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I embraced it with open arms and a resilient heart. Because this was my story to write. And I was ready to finish it. The last chapter of this journey was unlike anything I had imagined. Quiet yet profound, filled with moments of reckoning and grace. My father's health took a gentle but irreversible decline. Those final days were marked by a tenderness that seemed almost impossible given the years of silence and pain between us. I found myself sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, and finally allowing myself to feel the complex emotions that had been locked away for so long. There was sorrow, yes, but also a surprising sense of peace. It was as if, in those fragile moments, we had both been freed from the weight of the past. Nathan was there too, a quiet presence offering strength and comfort. Together, we navigated the bittersweet reality of loss and the tentative hope of healing what remained. In those hours, I realized that forgiveness isn't a destination but a journey, one that stretches across time and requires courage, vulnerability, and an open heart. It's about embracing the imperfect humanity in ourselves and others, finding light even in the darkest places. My mother's letters continued, becoming a lifeline that connected us despite the distance and pain. We were slowly building a new relationship, one grounded in honesty and a shared desire for understanding. As I reflected on everything, the wounds, the healing, the love, and the pain, I understood that family isn't defined by perfection. It's defined by the willingness to show up, to try, and to forgive. The memoir I wrote was no longer just my story. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of hope. It had opened doors for me and for others, creating a community bound by shared experience and a collective commitment to healing. Standing on the stage during my final speaking engagement of the year, I felt a profound gratitude. The audience wasn't just listening to my story. They were bearing witness to the journey of countless others who had found their voices through mine. I spoke about pain and forgiveness, about the scars that shape us and the strength we find in facing them. I spoke about family, not as a perfect ideal but as a messy, beautiful reality that challenges us to grow. As the applause filled the room, I knew that this was not the end. My story, like life itself, was a continuing journey, one that I would face with courage and grace. Walking off the stage that night, I felt a calm I had never known. The little girl who once felt invisible was now a woman standing firmly in her truth. And that truth was this: I am no longer defined by my past. I am defined by the choices I make every day, to forgive, to love, to heal. And with that, I was finally free.